Godzilla King of the Monsters is a fantastic monster movie. But does that make it a good movie as a whole? I'd argue yes, but we gotta lay down some ground rules for how this video is gonna go and why I think that is. First thing is, part 1 of this video is going to be exclusively talking about the movie itself. Part 2 is going to be talking about flaws in what I believe the critical consensus is right now. I say that in the sense of, not that they can't have this opinion, not that it's a wrong opinion, but merely that it's an inconsistent opinion with what we were told in regards to the first movie. With that out of the way, let's start with the actual film itself. Godzilla King of the Monsters, 2019 monster movie. It's got a lot of monsters in it, which is good. It's got a lot of action, which is good. It's funny, which is good. That is about all I have for the pros of this movie. The benefit of something like this, however, is that the movie is almost exclusively about those things. The movie is not about character development. It is not about well-written human characters. It is about Godzilla, hence the title. So when I go to this movie and there's a ton of brilliant action scenes, when there's a ton of stunning visuals, when there's a lot of fan service moments in regards to references to the series, it's phenomenal. The music in particular, with homages to the various themes and motifs of each of the characters, are fantastic. The sound design of the monster roars also being similar to the first movie, relatively new while still being reminiscent of the previous ones from older films. It's a really nice touch, especially in regards to King Ghidorah in this film. I loved the way that they presented each of the monsters in sequence. And the important thing to note about this movie is you gotta understand the history of all Godzilla films for how they were released. But I'll get into that into part 2. I would give this movie about a 8.5, maybe even 9 out of 10 for what it is. But if I were to just do this across the board for all movies, we kind of have a few stumbling blocks here. The human characters have writing issues, to put it simply. Some of them have little to no development, and others have a lot of development, but they aren't well fleshed out. To cite something from the movie, the villain characters do have arcs, and they do have a past, and they do have a lot of things going for them, but we'll say the logic from how they get from point A to point B is really, really stupid. I can't describe it any other way. So, putting it there, the characters are bad. Just flatly, they're bad, or at the very least, not very well developed. So, that's a stumbling block. Most of the movie is essentially just humans walking around on cool-looking sets, looking for excuses to have the next monster fight. And that's all the movie wanted to do, and this is why I'm not faulting it on that basis. So when you go in, don't expect to love the characters. There's a lot of really good talent in here, especially. I'm blanking on a lot of the actors' names right now, to be honest, but Ken Watanabe is really good. The girl who plays Eleven from Stranger Things does a fine performance, and overall, they just really fulfilled their roles. And that's all I really needed from them in this movie. So, if you're a fan of Godzilla, you don't even have to have watched like the whole series. It's not like all the callbacks are like mandatory for your enjoyment. But the more you know about the series, the more you're going to enjoy it. And the more you temper your expectations for this being a monster fight movie and not a well-written drama, character-driven story that happens to have giant monsters in it, the better time you're going to have. Which is what leads me to part 2. In the shortest possible terms, the critical consensus on this movie is that it is bad. That is not everyone's consensus, specifically the consensus of the critics. Now, here's what I am referring to when I talked about tempering your expectations. I don't play Sesame Street Elmo's A to Zoo Adventure, the video game, and say, man, this game didn't have any fatalities in it at all. This is a fucking ripoff. No. Instead, I look at it for what it is. It's a Sesame Street game. There's not going to be violence, there's not going to be gore. It's dumb to expect otherwise. So, take that into consideration when we're talking about this movie. I go into this movie expecting 3 things. Thing number 1, giant monsters. 2, giant monsters fighting. And 3, gorgeous visuals for both. At least for the technology that we have at the time. And this is not something that I want, but something that I expect is characters that are not particularly well developed, but lead the audience into the story so that we don't just have 90 minutes straight of monster fighting. See, most of the Godzilla movies are these monster brawls, these versus kind of movie. Godzilla versus Mothra, Godzilla versus the Smog Monster, Godzilla versus Destroya. That is the formula. We don't necessarily need human characters around for us to see these creatures fighting, because we enjoy that. But having human characters around to explain who these monsters are, what their powers are, how they gain their abilities, just everything around them is essential. It also means, we'll call it a budgetary constraint. It's very expensive to make these movies, whether they're CG ones like they currently are, suit ones like in the old school films. A lot of it is expensive. So, in addition to needing to build context, it's usually just not feasible to have 90 minutes straight of a monster fight, especially when it comes to choreography, keeping it interesting, and good action movies tend to have peaks and valleys, and it helps to make those moments more important, which is something that I loved most about the first movie. Now, to sort of reel this in, what do I mean when I said before that the critics are inconsistent? In the release of the first movie in this series, 2014's Godzilla by Gareth Edwards, the most consistent complaint is that there was not enough Godzilla. Say what you will about the rest of it, because some people had other things to say. Some people thought that the fights were underwhelming, some people thought that the human characters were dull, some people thought the movie was too long, some people thought they wasted Bryan Cranston, and these are all completely valid things to have. But if you look at most reviews for the movie, whether they be on Rotten Tomatoes or on YouTube, they always say there's not enough Godzilla.
And I'm on site right now when a huge, massive, epic monster battle is taking place just off screen where you cannot see it. I am bringing this news to you live, breaking into your coverage and telling you about the really awesome monster battle that's just off screen that you cannot see and we are not showing you right now. Oh my God, that is so awesome. I am so happy to bring you this special report so where you cannot see the massive, awesome monster battle. Back to you, Brian. The f is that? That movie did a lot to piss me off. The kid in me is disappointed. You see, it teases you the whole way and has little payoff at the end.
It can kind of disappoint also because, let's face it, you go into this movie and you're like, I want to see Godzilla tear shit up. That's not a ludicrous request for a Godzilla movie. But this movie doesn't really give you that for a long time. Godzilla is in like 2 scenes in the movie. Even in a couple scenes, you're like, oh shit, it's gonna go down. And then it's like, ah! This is a special news report. My God, that was very devastating. That city is just, it doesn't exist anymore. And my God, I wish you could have seen it. Odds are you wish you could have seen it too. I was like, come on. Enough with the ball-tickling teasing. For so long in this movie, you feel like you're on the 5th date with the movie and it's still giving you the hand job. You're like, come on. You know what I really want. And it is undeniably a bummer.
And that's another problem I did have with it, and I think that some people will have, I think the major complaint people might have walking out of this movie is that there actually wasn't quite enough Godzilla for a while. They teased these big fight scenes, and then you're kind of left hanging, and then finally you get some real meat, and it's awesome. But during the second act of the film, I won't spoil it, I won't get into it, but there was a scene that they were setting up, and then it didn't happen, and I was like, oh, I wish that happened because I would have loved to have seen that.
It's not to say that that's inherently wrong, but I would like to think on a personal level that there's some intent behind it. We're not here to discuss my opinion on the first movie, though. The simple thing is, the critical consensus of the time was, it's a fine movie, however there's not enough Godzilla in this Godzilla movie, there's too much focus on human characters, so moving forward, or at least the idea behind a criticism is for the sake of improvement, is the sequel should feature more monster fights. It should feature more Godzilla. Plain and simple. So, lo and behold, 5 years later, as well as Kong Skull Island in the meantime, what do we have? We have this movie, which features significantly more monsters, significantly more monster fights, significantly more Godzilla as a whole. And what do we have? Oh no! They don't like it! Holy shit. And this would be fine if it was just a matter of, oh, maybe Godzilla's around a ton, but the visuals are bad, or there's barely any fighting, or he doesn't do anything, or yada yada. There's other stuff for it, but if you actually read these reviews, they mention that they don't like it because there's not enough time to develop the human characters. And they say that there's so much time dedicated to monster fights that there's no way to build the story. And it makes me want to fucking explode, man. I'm like, what do you want? What do you want out of the movie? You specifically asked for more Godzilla and less focus on the humans. You got exactly that. The thing that I'll say, and this is referenced in Jeremy John's review, is they said, we want more monsters and less humans. They got exactly that, and now it's getting shit on. So, why would we trust reviewers on this?
We all really liked the last Godzilla movie. There were people online, though, who were like, I didn't like it. It didn't show Godzilla enough. It teased him, but then he only showed up at the very end to do some stuff. And I get that complaint, but I see why they did it the way they did it in that Godzilla movie. And after seeing Godzilla, King of the Monsters, I really understand why they went that route with the last Godzilla movie. So I will give this movie that. It listened to fans. You wanted to see more Godzilla, you see more of him in this movie. You wanted to see Godzilla fight more monsters, you see more of that in this movie.
And I myself am a reviewer. I'm not going to try and, exclude myself from this camp. But when I review movies, I at least like to be very clear about my reasoning for why I like or dislike movies. In this case, it's a matter of intent versus outcome. Sesame Street doesn't try and do fatalities. This monster movie does not try and do character development for the humans, at least not very much compared to its predecessors. And then they say the movie is bad as a consequence of this. They are demanding something of the movie that the movie never attempted to do. And then they are, well, in this case, they're punishing it for it. There are a lot of instances in the movie and video game industry where ratings do affect employment, pay, all sorts of factors. And that's why it's very important for people to get good reviews. Not even for the sake of, pride, but just as, an industry standard. Alright? So here's the thing. Does a critic have to like the movie just because of what I say? No. But what I'd like to put forward is that you shouldn't trust people who have demonstrably inconsistent opinions on these things. You cannot ask for a monster movie with more monsters, get it, and then say it's bad because it did what you wanted. And what I'd like to point to is what I believe a hypothesis for this. I think that the critics of today wanted Gareth Edwards' first feature directorial film, Monsters. In this case, a person goes beneath the Mexican-United States border to get the daughter of his boss. And in this universe, a alien species has infected most of the northern areas of Mexico. So they have to navigate in the jungles and outskirts and various dangerous places that are infected with these monsters from southern Mexico to the US border. And the movie is primarily focused on world building and character-driven drama. While monsters are present, they aren't at the forefront, they're mostly kept in the shadow, and they aren't even in a majority of the film. They're sort of allegorical to the dangers that immigration poses in this movie, as opposed to actually being about the monsters. So, what you get is a pretty good film, honestly. Monsters is a good film, and I can see why people like it. The reason I bring this up, though, is because I believe that's what the reviewers wanted out of this movie. I'm not gonna go on my way to call them pretentious, but a lot of them seem to think that they're above the common crowd. They tend to think that these sort of action films, I'm not gonna say low intelligence, but they're just not high intellectual films. You don't need to be a genius to watch Godzilla punch a giant dragon and say, oh, I understand. You just get it. It's just fun. And they tend to think it's a lower form of entertainment. So when this movie comes out and it doesn't give them that high form of entertainment, that drama, that, Oscar-nominated performance that they look for in these things, they just tend to shit on it. They just tend to think it's like, oh, a Godzilla film. Oh, it's beneath me. And you can see it very plainly here. I consider their opinions to be of low weight, low value. Not wrong, not like, oh, you can just, like, discard them. Because this is what I would say the value of these reviews is. The value I get out of the review that I am looking at here, these Rotten Tomatoes scores, these Metacritic scores, is simply this. I have a better understanding of what critics as a whole, in regards to movies, say about it. And there is value in that, because now I get to tear apart the reasoning. I get entertainment out of it, especially when I get to look at what they present as arguments and break it down. And we've seen this across the board when it comes to movies and video games. Just critics not being on the level with gamers. And it's not because they have incorrect opinions. They don't have wrong opinions. Their criteria is different, and they seem either ignorant of this, or they refuse to acknowledge it. If I were to press someone on this particular movie, I'd say, was it an action movie with more monsters than before? They would say yes. And I would say, isn't it a movie that's trying to be an action movie and you said they wanted more monsters? They would say yes. And I'd say, is it a good movie? And they'd say no. And I'm like, can you trust someone who is as disingenuous as that? Because say what you will about my opinions, I've had a lot of things that I don't necessarily think are popular opinions. I even look back at some of my previous videos and I'm like, what was I thinking? I had a very favorable view of Justice League when it came out, and that's aged as well as fine milk on a hot summer day. You can be inconsistent, but I think the important thing is sincerity. Most of these people will not be able to address anything in regards to incongruences with their opinion. And this is why I pointed out a potential incongruity with my review for Maw in regards to it. Just shitting on it for its own sake, because I've occasionally been accused of being a contrarian, like, oh, you don't like it because it's popular. And I'm like, no, far from it. There are a lot of movies that I love, and a lot of really unpopular movies that I don't love. It's very common and popular to shit on Twilight. I do that. It's very, very common for people to praise Get Out. I do that. It's more a matter of what am I looking for in a movie. I came in looking for Godzilla to kick ass, and the humans didn't matter to me. And he did. And this is important because there's two types of Godzilla films in the series. Number one, the dramatic Godzilla. The original movie, the 80s reboot, and Shin Godzilla all fall under this umbrella of a dramatic Godzilla film. I say this in the sense that the first one was not about monsters fighting. It was supposed to be an allegory for nuclear war. The second one was also supposed to be essentially that. Then Shin Godzilla was supposed to be about nuclear waste as well as government mismanagement. They were here to have some spectacle because the spectacle of Godzilla in all of them is important. Very good special effects, very good music. A lot of it is very important for getting that message across. Keeping that in mind, every other movie in the series, in the franchise as a whole, is about monsters fighting monsters. That's it. The movie that came out immediately after Godzilla was him fighting with Anguirus and them just causing destruction, and all of the more dramatic points about, continuing on after the nuclear tragedy of World War II, and recognizing that these sort of extremely destructive weapons are not the way forward. That's kind of out the window. You look at any of the Versus movies, and it's literally just, Godzilla's been spotted. Oh no, something else roughly his size, by sheer coincidence, has been spotted. Then they fight, and a bunch of people talk. You look at a million of these movies, and there's not really many in them that have good characters. They don't really have good plot development. It's just an excuse to get the monsters to fight. even some of my favorite ones that are considered the absolute best in the series, like Godzilla vs. Destroya, they don't really have much when it comes to great characters. They just kinda go around their lives and happen to show up in important places. The only times that they're relevant are if they have, monsters that they make themselves, like the Mechagodzillas and the Mogiras. So it's not that they aren't relevant to the plot as much as, for the most part, character development is not their focus. So, with that in mind, Godzilla King of the Monsters is very consistent with the series. The 2014 one presented Godzilla like a natural disaster, along with the Mutos with them. They were terrifying because it just seemed like consequences of the past coming and wreaking havoc. And while the fighting was awesome, especially the finale of the first one, the way they presented it was very consistent with its ethos of the first one always has to be dramatic. And there's a lot of character development and build-up. You've seen with people saying that. They're like, Godzilla doesn't show up for an hour in his own movie. What's that shit? And I'm like, have you seen any of the other films? Godzilla usually takes forever to show up in these films, and they usually spend a lot of time developing the characters and the world first. So, it's a matter of people, to me, being naive about what these movies are attempting. Every other movie following that is just a bunch of beat-em-ups. This is completely consistent with the series, and people are shitting on it for doing what other people would demand of a series. You look at a lot of movies that have new entries, and people are like, oh, this is a disgrace to the series. This ruined my childhood because it strayed too far from its roots. This one is firmly cemented in its roots, and people are kicking the trunk of the tree like it's done something wrong. Keep that mindset with this. And it's not just for this movie, but it's a lot of movies. I personally do not think you should trust most professional critics on the basis that they do not have consistent criteria for what makes a good movie or even what makes an enjoyable movie. That's not to say distrust every critic. I'm one of those too. So, you should only trust someone who has consistent opinions. Because it's not really a hard franchise to mess up. And they didn't. This is why I think so highly of the film. It just has a lot of really cool monster fights. Is everything, super extremely logical or down to earth? No. But it's at least internally consistent with what it's trying to do. And that's about all I ask for. Not even the best Godzilla movies can always do that. So, I say you should go see this movie. And I say that you should take things that most critics say about films in general, especially in this one, with a pinch of salt. Because no one can be very clear on what they actually want unless you do a deeper dive. And it's a shame because there are some people who will go for critic reviews before deciding to see a movie. I was supposed to see Ma this past week with a friend. They read a critic's review before going to see it, and then they decided against it. And mind you, I went to an advanced screening. It was a free ticket. They did not have to pay a cent, and they could have seen a movie, and they decided no because the critic said something bad about it when I personally thought it was good. And the audience had a good time as well. Do not let people who are insincere and inconsistent dictate what kind of entertainment that you can consume. See you next time.